The front row of the Roman Colosseum was the most coveted seating in the ancient world, and quite possibly the most dangerous place to sit at a public entertainment event in all of human history. Senators in white togas, Vestal Virgins in their sacred robes, the emperor himself on his gilded podium, all of them seated close enough to the arena floor to smell the blood on the sand. Between these most important spectators in Rome and the lions, the gladiators, and the condemned criminals fighting below them, there was, for much of the Colosseum's history, almost nothing at all. Tonight, we move slowly through the extraordinary, violent, and surprisingly complicated world of front-row seating at the greatest arena ever built. Let your body settle, your breathing slow, and let the ancient stone and distant roar of the Roman crowd carry your thoughts gently towards sleep. On a warm Roman afternoon in the 2nd century, a senator adjusted his white toga, leaned slightly forward in his front-row seat, and watched a North African lion pace the arena floor 20 feet below him. The barrier between that senator and the lion was a wooden railing, perhaps some nets, and the considerable psychological deterrent of 50,000 screaming Romans. Whether that barrier was sufficient depended entirely on the lion's mood, the height of the railing, and a set of engineering decisions made by people who had never personally been in the front row when something went wrong. Tonight we explore, slowly and with considerable detail, exactly how dangerous that front row actually was, and what the Romans who sat there understood, and perhaps misunderstood, about the risks they were taking. Let the ancient evening air of the Colosseum settle around you now, and let this slow, careful story of Rome's most dangerous seats carry you gently toward rest. The Colosseum, known to the Romans as the Flavian Amphitheater, was completed in 80 AD under the Emperor Titus, after approximately 10 years of construction. It was built on the site of an artificial lake that had been part of Nero's vast private palace complex, a deliberately political act, returning pleasure grounds to the people of Rome. The building could seat between 50,000 and 80,000 spectators. Estimates vary depending on how tightly the ancient Romans were willing to pack themselves onto the stone seats. Nothing like it had existed before in the ancient world, and nothing comparable would be built again for nearly 2,000 years. It was an engineering achievement of such ambition and complexity that its methods of construction are still not entirely understood by modern architects and engineers. The seating arrangements of the Colosseum were not a matter of personal preference. They were a precise reflection of Roman social hierarchy, enforced by law. The lowest tier, the podium level, closest to the arena floor, was reserved for senators, magistrates, foreign ambassadors, and the emperor's personal guests. Above them sat the equestrian class, the second tier of Roman society, wealthy businessmen and military officers who were important but not quite senatorial. Higher still were the ordinary Roman citizens, free men of the city who had a right to attend but no right to choose where they sat. At the very top, in the cheap and partially uncovered upper tiers, sat women of the lower classes, slaves attending their masters, and the very poorest residents of Rome. The emperor's box, the pulvinar, was positioned at the podium level, directly on the central axis of the building. From this position, the emperor had the best possible view of the arena floor, close enough to see the expressions on the faces of gladiators, far enough to be protected by the full depth of the podium barrier. The emperor's presence at the games was itself a political performance. His reactions to the violence below him were closely watched by 50,000 spectators. When the emperor gave the thumbs signal that determined whether a defeated gladiator lived or died, it was a demonstration of absolute power performed before the largest audience in the Roman world. Everything about the front row, its privileges, its dangers, its political meaning, was concentrated most intensely in the emperor's box. Among the most remarkable occupants of the Colosseum's front row were the Vestal Virgins, Rome's most sacred female priestesses. Women were generally relegated to the distant upper tiers of the Colosseum, where their view of the arena was poor and their social separation from the male spectators complete. The Vestal Virgins were the exception. Their sacred status gave them privileges denied to virtually every other woman in Rome. They sat in the front row, beside the senators and magistrates, their white robes and veiled heads making them immediately recognizable in the crowd. The contrast between their sacred, untouchable status, and the violent spectacle taking place 20 feet below them was one that Roman artists and writers found endlessly interesting. The gladiators who entered the Colosseum's arena were aware of the front row in a very specific way. Their performance was primarily for the crowd as a whole, but the judgments that determined their survival came from the front row. The emperor, the senators, the most important people in Rome. These were the people the gladiator was ultimately performing for. A gladiator who played to the crowd, who fought with style and courage, who acknowledged his audience in the traditional way, was appealing directly to the people whose decision would determine whether he walked out of the arena or was carried out. The front row was not merely an audience. It was a court, and the gladiators who understood this distinction fought more intelligently than those who did not. The arena floor of the Colosseum, the word arena itself means sand in Latin, was a complex and carefully engineered space. Beneath the sand lay a wooden floor, and beneath that an elaborate system of tunnels, chambers, and lifting mechanisms that allowed animals, scenery, and performers to appear suddenly from below. The sand itself served a practical purpose. It absorbed blood and other bodily fluids, making the surface easier to clean and reducing the visual accumulation of carnage. Between events, teams of arena workers would rake the sand smooth, remove the dead and injured, and reset whatever equipment the next event required. From the front row, this resetting process was visible in intimate detail. The blood-stained sand, the discarded weapons, the marks left by the previous entertainment clearly legible to those seated closest to the floor. The venations, the wild animal hunts that were one of the Colosseum's most popular features, were among the most dangerous events for front-row spectators. Animals from across the Roman Empire were brought to the Colosseum's underground cages: lions, tigers, leopards, bears, elephants, rhinoceroses, hippopotamuses, and crocodiles. These animals were released into the arena in a variety of configurations, sometimes to fight each other, sometimes to be hunted by trained fighters called venators, sometimes to be pitted against condemned criminals. The front row's proximity to these animals, separated from them by a barrier whose adequacy was a matter of ongoing experimentation, was a source of both excitement and genuine risk. A Roman senator who had paid a great deal in social capital for his front row seat had implicitly accepted a level of proximity to large carnivores that no modern sporting venue would permit. The barriers that protected front-row spectators from the animals in the arena below were not a permanent or standardized feature of the Colosseum. Different events required different barrier configurations. Some events had no barrier at all, others had elaborate systems of nets, walls, and protective structures. The responsibility for ensuring that spectators were adequately protected rested with the editor, the official responsible for organizing and presenting the games. An editor whose barrier failed, whose lion escaped into the seats, or whose net proved inadequate for the particular animal on display, faced serious consequences, both legal and social. The engineering of spectator protection in the Roman arena was therefore a matter of considerable professional concern, driven partly by genuine care for spectator safety and partly by fear of the consequences of getting it wrong. The individual seats of the Colosseum's front row were not merely reserved by social class. They were often reserved for specific individuals, inscribed with names or designations carved into the stone. These inscriptions, some of which survive today, tell us who sat in specific seats: a senator named Dexter, a group of priests of a specific cult, the representatives of a particular professional guild. Having your name carved into a front-row seat at the Colosseum was a permanent declaration of status, more durable than a title, more public than a palace. The competition for these named seats was intense, involving political favor, financial generosity, and careful management of relationships with the right officials. To sit in a named front-row seat was to occupy one of the most socially significant positions in the Roman world for as long as the games lasted. A full day at the Colosseum followed a recognizable program that remained relatively consistent across the building's centuries of use. The morning session featured the venations, the animal hunts that opened the entertainment and established the spectacle scale. At midday, the arena was used for the execution of condemned criminals, the most legally and morally complex part of the program. The afternoon's main event was the gladiatorial combat, the discipline-specific contests between trained fighters that were the Colosseum's most technically sophisticated entertainment. The front-row spectator who arrived in the morning and stayed through the afternoon experienced all three of these very different forms of violence in succession, each carrying its own particular quality of danger for the seats nearest the sand. Beneath the arena floor lay the hypogeum, a network of underground corridors, rooms, and mechanical systems that made the Colosseum's spectacles possible. Animals were held in cages in the hypogeum, sometimes for days before their event, in conditions of considerable stress and increasing agitation. Elevator systems, counterweight platforms operated by teams of workers, could raise animals and scenery directly through trapdoors in the arena floor. The moment when a trapdoor opened and an animal emerged suddenly into the arena was one of the most dramatic effects in the Colosseum's repertoire. From the front row, this emergence was visible in extremely close proximity, the animal appearing from below at a distance of perhaps 30 feet, its first confused moments in the light playing out in front of the most important spectators in Rome. The Colosseum was used for approximately 4 centuries, from its opening under Titus in 80 AD to the last gladiatorial contests in the early 5th century. Across those 4 centuries, the building was modified repeatedly, its barrier systems improved, its underground mechanisms elaborated, its seating arrangements adjusted. The danger of the front row varied across this long period. Some emperors invested heavily in spectator protection, others were more cavalier about the risks. The history of front row safety at the Colosseum is therefore not a single story, but a long, evolving negotiation between the desire to bring spectators as close to the action as possible and the practical necessity of keeping them alive. Let this negotiation unfold slowly through the chapters ahead, as we explore exactly what the front row of the Colosseum was, who sat in it, and what could go wrong. The animals that appeared in the Colosseum came from every corner of the Roman Empire and beyond, a global supply chain of exotic wildlife organized specifically for the arena. North Africa provided lions, leopards, and ostriches. The forests of Caledonia provided bears. India and Persia provided tigers. Africa's rivers provided crocodiles and hippopotamuses. The capture, transportation, and delivery of these animals was a significant industry, employing hunters, animal handlers, ship captains, and a complex network of holding facilities across the empire. Animals arrived at the Colosseum in varying states of health and agitation, some exhausted by weeks of travel, others still vigorous and deeply dangerous. The condition of an animal on the day of its arena appearance was unpredictable in ways that made safety planning for front-row spectators genuinely complicated. The lion was the most prestigious and most dangerous animal in the Colosseum's repertoire. A large male North African lion could weigh over 500 pounds, stand 4 feet at the shoulder, and cover 30 feet in a single bound. The podium wall that separated the front row seats from the arena floor was typically between 15 and 20 feet high, a barrier that a determined lion could theoretically attempt to scale. Whether this actually occurred is a matter of some historical uncertainty. The ancient sources report incidents of animals escaping barriers without always specifying the precise mechanism. What is certain is that the Romans were sufficiently aware of this possibility to experiment continuously with barrier designs throughout the Colosseum's active period. The primary barrier system used in the Colosseum consisted of 2 elements, the podium wall itself and a system of nets stretched above it. The nets were made of rope and were hung from poles or frames mounted on top of the podium wall, extending outward and upward to create a barrier that an animal jumping from below would theoretically become entangled in. The design of these nets was a subject of ongoing practical refinement. The materials, the mesh size, the height of the poles, and the tension of the system all affecting its effectiveness. Ancient writers mention these nets in passing, usually in the context of describing spectacular Venatio events, their presence so familiar to Roman audiences that it required no extended explanation. The net system was the primary concession to front-row safety in an entertainment culture that otherwise showed limited interest in protecting its spectators from the consequences of their proximity to large predators. The leopard was, in some ways, more dangerous for front-row spectators than the lion. Faster, lighter, and significantly better at vertical movement. A leopard can climb a tree vertically in seconds, A 15-foot podium wall presented a very different challenge to a leopard than it did to a lion. Ancient sources record incidents in which leopards made contact with the barrier systems, testing them in ways that lions, heavier and less agile, typically did not. The speed of a leopard attack was also qualitatively different. Where a lion's charge gave some warning, a leopard could move from stillness to full speed in a fraction of a second. Front row spectators watching a leopard venatio were sitting close to an animal that was, by any objective measure, faster and more agile than the barrier between them. The rhinoceros presented different challenges for arena safety, not primarily as a climber, but as a projectile. A charging rhinoceros weighs between 2,000 and 4,000 pounds and can reach speeds of 30 miles per hour. The impact of a rhinoceros against a barrier was of a different order entirely from any other animal in the arena repertoire. Ancient accounts of rhinoceros appearances in the arena focus on the animal's destructive power, the damage it did to scenery, to other animals, and to the arena floor itself. Whether a rhinoceros ever seriously threatened the podium wall is unrecorded, but the possibility was the kind of thing that an editor responsible for spectator safety would have thought about very carefully before booking the animal. Elephants appeared regularly in the Roman arena, though their use was more varied than most other animals. In some cases, elephants were trained performers, doing tricks, walking tightropes, and in one memorable ancient account, writing letters in the sand with their trunks. In other cases, elephants were used in combat, pitted against rhinoceroses, bears, or large groups of armed men. An angry or frightened elephant in an enclosed arena was, by any measure, extraordinarily dangerous, their intelligence making them more purposeful in their destructive behavior than a lion or a bear. The front row spectators watching an elephant performance were seated within range of an animal capable of throwing a 2,000-pound tree trunk, a fact that the Romans seem to have accepted with remarkable equanimity. The Colosseum's arena could be partially flooded. The underground drainage system could be blocked and water introduced to allow for aquatic displays. Crocodiles, which appeared in these aquatic events, presented a specific set of dangers for front-row spectators. A Nile crocodile can reach 15 feet in length and weigh over 2,000 pounds, an animal that is considerably more mobile on land than it appears. The image of crocodiles in a flooded arena, 20 feet below a senator's marble seat, is one of the more surreal combinations of privilege and peril that the Roman entertainment industry ever produced. Whether the crocodile's presence in the flooded arena created any genuine threat to front-row spectators is unclear, but it is the kind of situation in which most modern safety regulations would require considerably more than a rope net. Bears were among the most commonly used large animals in the Roman arena, available from the forests of northern and eastern Europe in sufficient quantities to appear regularly rather than as exotic rarities. A large male European brown bear weighs up to 1,500 pounds and is a capable climber, one of the few large predators that can both swim effectively and scale vertical surfaces. Ancient sources record bears breaking through or circumventing barrier systems on several occasions. The specifics are rarely provided, but the incidents are mentioned with sufficient frequency to suggest they were not entirely rare. The front-row spectator watching a bear venatio was seated closest to an animal with both the size to breach a barrier by force and the physical capability to climb over one. The Romans appear to have been aware of this particular combination of risks. Bear events in the ancient sources are sometimes noted as having required additional barrier precautions. Some venatio events released multiple species simultaneously, creating an unpredictable and genuinely chaotic arena environment. The interaction between different species, lions pursuing ostriches, leopards encountering bears, exotic ungulates fleeing in all directions, made the arena's behavior entirely impossible to predict. For the front row, a multi-species venatio event multiplied the number of potential barrier testing scenarios. Instead of one animal's behavior to anticipate, the editor responsible for safety had to consider dozens of possible interactions. Ancient sources describe these mass animal events with considerable enthusiasm for their spectacle and relatively little discussion of their safety implications. The confidence that this implies, that 50,000 Romans, including the most important people in the empire, could watch chaotic multi-species animal events with nothing between them and the arena but a wall and some nets, is itself a remarkable statement about Roman attitudes toward risk. Incidents in which animals made contact with or breached the arena's barrier systems did occur across the Colosseum's history. The most frequently cited ancient account describes lions or leopards somehow reaching spectators, though the precise details are debated by modern historians. The Roman writer Martial, who attended the Colosseum during the reign of Domitian, mentions animals behaving unexpectedly near the barrier without specifying exactly what occurred. The absence of detailed accounts of specific escape incidents may reflect the Roman tendency to avoid recording events that reflected poorly on the game's safety management. An editor whose animal had killed a senator in the front row would have had powerful motivations to suppress detailed accounts, making the historical record of actual escape incidents incomplete by design. The barrier systems were not the only protection available to front-row spectators. Armed soldiers stationed around the perimeter of the arena provided a secondary layer of protection. These soldiers, typically drawn from the Praetorian Guard or other elite military units, were positioned to intervene if an animal breached the primary barrier. Their effectiveness depended on the situation. A soldier with a spear is a meaningful deterrent to many animals, but a charging rhinoceros or a large male lion in full attack is a different proposition. The soldiers' presence was also partly theatrical. Their armed positions around the arena's edge were visible to spectators and contributed to the sense that the situation was under control. Whether they were actually capable of stopping a large predator that had breached the barrier before it reached the front row seats is a question that, fortunately, the historical record does not require us to answer definitively. The historical record contains references to modifications of the Colosseum's barrier systems in response to specific incidents or perceived risks. Nero, who presided over spectacles in an earlier amphitheater before the Colosseum was built, reportedly raised the barrier height after animals came closer to spectators than intended. Whether similar modifications were made to the Colosseum itself in response to incidents is not definitively recorded, but the ongoing evolution of the barrier system suggests that it was understood as a work in progress rather than a fixed and final solution. Each emperor who gave games at the Colosseum made implicit decisions about the acceptable level of risk to front-row spectators, decisions shaped by their own values, their relationships with the Senate, and their understanding of what the Roman crowd would accept. Some emperors were more cavalier about spectator safety than others, for reasons that ranged from genuine indifference to a calculated willingness to create an. The Emperor Commodus presented the Colosseum with a unique safety challenge. He insisted on personally participating in arena events. Commodus fought in the arena hundreds of times, according to ancient sources, shooting arrows at animals, fighting as a gladiator, and engaging in theatrical combat of various kinds. His arena appearances required a reconfiguration of the normal safety arrangements. The emperor in the arena was simultaneously the most important person to protect and the person who had chosen to place himself in the most dangerous position. Ancient sources describe Commodus using the arena for events that came dangerously close to the front row, including incidents in which he fired arrows from the arena floor toward animals that had retreated toward the barrier wall. The senators and Vestal Virgins in the front row, watching their emperor fire arrows from the arena floor in their general direction, experienced a form of front-row danger that had nothing to do with escaped animals. One of the most vividly described incidents of Commodus's arena career involved ostriches. Commodus shot the heads off several ostriches with crescent-shaped arrows, then walked toward the senatorial front row carrying the severed heads. The implicit message, that he could just as easily be holding their heads, was understood perfectly by the senators watching. The historian Cassius Dio, who was present as a senator, records that he and his colleagues suppressed their laughter at this grotesque display by chewing laurel leaves from their victory garlands. The front row at a Commodus Arena event was dangerous in a way that transcended the usual animal-related risks. It was dangerous because the man in the arena was the most powerful person in the world, and he was making a point about that power. The physical structure of the podium wall has been studied by modern archaeologists and engineers attempting to assess its effectiveness as an animal barrier. The wall was constructed of stone and brick, and its height, approximately 13 to 15 feet at the arena floor level, was the primary barrier against most animals. Modern analysis suggests that this height was probably adequate for most lions and bears in normal circumstances, but that unusual behavior, a running start, or a particularly large individual animal could have reduced the margin significantly. The wall's smoothness, deliberately maintained to prevent animals from gaining purchase with their claws, was an important design feature that is sometimes overlooked in accounts of arena safety. The engineers who designed and maintained the Colosseum's barrier systems were solving a genuinely difficult problem: how to bring the world's most dangerous animals within sight of the world's most important people while keeping those people alive. The routine of the Colosseum's animal events ended, for most animals, in their death, either at the hands of the venators or through other means when the event concluded. The removal of large dead animals from the arena floor was itself a significant logistical operation, requiring teams of workers, ropes, and sometimes mechanical assistance. From the front row, this removal process was entirely visible: the blood-soaked sand, the dead animal being dragged by ropes, the arena workers moving efficiently through their practiced routines. The intimacy of the front row meant that none of the Colosseum's operational reality was hidden from its most important spectators. A senator in the front row saw everything: the animals at their most dangerous and their most dead, the arena at its most theatrical and its most mechanical, the spectacle and the infrastructure that produced it. The gladiatorial combats that were the Colosseum's most technically sophisticated entertainment presented a different kind of danger for front-row spectators than the animal events. A gladiator, unlike a lion, understood what the front row was and who sat in it. This made him simultaneously more controllable and, in certain circumstances, considerably more dangerous. The relationship between the front row and the gladiators performing before it was complex, a mixture of performance, appeal, and implicit power negotiation that had no equivalent in the animal events. Tonight, we explore this relationship slowly: the trained fighter and the powerful spectator, separated by 20 feet of sand and a social distance of incalculable magnitude. What the gladiator thought of the people in the front row, and what the front row thought of him, is one of the more fascinating and least fully documented aspects of Colosseum history. The gladiatorial system produced a wide range of fighter types, each with specific equipment, fighting styles, and traditional opponents. The Murmillo fought with a large rectangular shield and a short sword, wearing a helmet with a distinctive fish crest. The Retiarius fought without a helmet, using a net and trident, the most theatrical of gladiatorial styles, relying on mobility and entanglement rather than direct confrontation. The Secutor was specifically designed to fight the Retiarius, his smooth helmet giving the net nothing to catch, his small eye holes protecting him from the trident. Each matchup had its own traditional dynamic, its own spectator expectations, and its own patterns of movement across the arena floor, patterns that sometimes brought the fighters very close to the front row barrier. The arena floor of the Colosseum was large enough, roughly 83 by 48 meters, to give gladiatorial combats room to develop. But the dynamics of a fight, with one gladiator driving the other backward, or two fighters circling each other in a pattern that gradually drifted toward the edge, sometimes brought the combat close to the podium wall. A gladiator fighting with his back to the wall, unable to retreat further, was fighting in the position of greatest danger, and the front row spectators were the closest witnesses to this extremity. The noise from the front row at these moments was different from the general crowd noise, more immediate, more personal, the senators and officials close enough to see the sweat and the fear. Being a front row spectator at this moment meant being separated from two men fighting for their lives by approximately 20 feet and a stone wall. When a gladiator defeated his opponent and the loser appealed for mercy, raising his finger in the traditional gesture of submission, the decision rested with the crowd and ultimately with the editor or emperor in the front row. The gladiator who had once stood over his fallen opponent and looked to the front row, waiting for the signal that determined whether he killed or spared the man beneath him. This moment, the victor, the vanquished, and the most powerful people in Rome all connected in a single decision, was the emotional center of gladiatorial combat. The front row spectator who gave the thumb signal in this moment was participating directly in the event in a way that no other spectator could. The distinction between audience and decision-maker briefly collapsed. The power this represented, literal power over life and death, exercised before 50,000 witnesses, was part of what made the front row so socially significant and so intensely desired. The actual meaning of the Roman thumb signal for life or death is, somewhat remarkably, still debated by historians. The popular image of thumbs up for life and thumbs down for death is not clearly supported by the ancient sources. Some scholars believe that a hidden thumb, tucked into the fist, indicated mercy, while a displayed thumb indicated death. Others argue that the direction of the thumb imitated the movement of a sword, thrust forward for death, turned back for life. What is certain is that the front row spectators were the primary audience for this signal, and their reaction to the decision, approval or disapproval, was the immediate social context in which it was made. The editor, the official responsible for presenting the games, held the primary power to decide a gladiator's fate, though in practice the crowd's expressed preference was usually followed. An editor who ignored the crowd's preference for mercy and ordered a popular gladiator killed risked immediate and noisy disapproval from 50,000 spectators. An editor who ignored the crowd's call for death and spared an unpopular fighter risked accusations of weakness and poor judgment. The decision was therefore not entirely free. It was a performance of power within constraints set by the crowd. The front row spectator watching an editor navigate this decision was watching one of the most compressed and public demonstrations of political skill that the Roman world offered. Skilled gladiators understood that the front row was their most important audience, and some fought in ways that deliberately engaged this section of the crowd. A gladiator who moved his fight toward the podium wall gave the front row spectators an unusually close view, bringing the detail of the combat within a distance where individual techniques, expressions, and tactical decisions were clearly visible. This was a calculated risk. Fighting near the wall reduced the gladiators' options for movement, but it was also a performance choice that could generate enthusiastic front row approval. The approval of the front row mattered to a gladiator in the most practical possible way. It was the section of the crowd whose decision would determine whether he lived or died if he was defeated. Playing to the front row was, for a skilled gladiator, both an aesthetic choice and a survival strategy. The moment of submission, when a wounded gladiator acknowledged defeat by raising his finger, was one of the most significant theatrical moments in Roman public life. The crowd's immediate reaction to this gesture was an expression of collective feeling that the editor had to read and respond to within seconds. The front row's reaction was particularly significant. The senators and officials whose approval the editor most needed to retain were the spectators whose response he was most carefully watching. A popular gladiator who submitted after a brave fight typically received mercy. The crowd's fondness for him expressed in the noise and gesture that communicated their preference to the editor. An unpopular gladiator, or one who had fought poorly, received a less sympathetic response. The front row's silence or downward gestures as eloquent as any spoken judgment. The Colosseum's history includes incidents in which gladiators refused to perform, a form of resistance that placed both the gladiator and the editor in an impossible position. A gladiator who refused to enter the arena could be beaten and driven in by arena workers, but a gladiator who stood passively in the arena and refused to fight was more difficult to manage. Ancient sources record incidents of this kind, noting that forced combat between an unwilling fighter and a willing opponent produced results that satisfied no one. The front row's reaction to these incidents was typically hostile. The spectators who had come for skilled combat found passive resistance not merely disappointing but insulting. The social contract of the Colosseum, the implicit agreement between performer and audience, was broken by a gladiator who refused to perform, and the front row, as the most important part of the audience, felt this breach most acutely. Some gladiators achieved genuine celebrity in Roman society, their names known across the city, their fighting styles discussed and analyzed by fans. The front row at a bout featuring a celebrated gladiator was a different atmosphere from the routine card. The senators and officials who were normally reserved in their reactions showing something closer to genuine enthusiasm. Ancient graffiti found in Pompeii describes specific gladiators in terms of their physical appearance and fighting style, evidence that these men were objects of detailed public interest extending well beyond the arena. A front-row spectator who watched a celebrated gladiator fight at close range was in a position of unique privilege, close enough to see the technique that the graffiti writers analyzed, close enough to make the celebrity real rather than imagined. The relationship between Roman society's most powerful people and these often enslaved fighters who entertained them was one of the more psychologically complicated aspects of the Colosseum's SOC. The weapons used in gladiatorial combat were designed for their visual impact as much as their lethality. The Colosseum's most important product was spectacle, and the weapons were part of that spectacle. The gladius, the short Roman sword, was a weapon designed for close-quarters combat, most effective within a few feet of the opponent. The trident of the retiarius was a weapon of theater as much as combat, its long handle giving the fighter a reach advantage, and its three-pronged head producing dramatic visual effects when it made contact. The net was perhaps the most theatrical weapon in the arena repertoire, its use requiring coordination, timing, and a willingness to rely on technique rather than force. From the front row, the detail of these weapons was entirely visible. The sharpness of the blade, the weight of the shield, the condition of the net, all legible to spectators 20 feet away. Among the most disturbing events that the front row spectators of the Colosseum witnessed were the staged mythological executions, theatrical spectacles in which condemned criminals were killed in ways that dramatized famous myths. A condemned man might be dressed as Orpheus and killed by bears while music played. Another might be dressed as Prometheus and subjected to simulated eagle attacks. These events combined the theatrical ambition of Roman spectacle culture with the judicial function of public execution, producing something that the Roman audience experienced as entertainment and the condemned experienced rather differently. The front row's proximity to these events meant that the theatrical staging, the costumes, the scenery, the careful choreography was fully visible, as was the real suffering of the person at the center of the drama. That Roman society's most educated and sophisticated members, senators, philosophers, former consuls, sat in the front row for these events is one of the historical facts that most resists comfortable modern interpreta. Roman attitudes toward gladiatorial combat were not uniformly enthusiastic. A significant strand of Roman intellectual life found the games troubling. The philosopher Seneca wrote with genuine distress about his experience of watching arena events, describing how the moral atmosphere of the crowd degraded individual judgment. Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher-emperor, attended the games because his imperial duties required it, but spent the time working through paperwork, his presence in the front row a form of duty rather than pleasure. Yet these critics continued to attend, continued to sit in the front row when their status required it, and continued to participate in the social rituals of the arena. The gap between what the Roman intellectual tradition said about the arena and what the same intellectuals actually did when they sat in the front row is one of the more illuminating contradictions in Roman cultural history. The intensity of Colosseum violence varied significantly across different emperors' reigns. Marcus Aurelius attempted to reduce gladiatorial deaths, requiring blunted weapons in training bouts and encouraging the sparing of defeated fighters. These reforms were largely reversed by his son Commodus, who combined the opposite inclinations with a personal enthusiasm for arena participation that created its own problems. The front row experience under different emperors was therefore quite different in its emotional character. The same seats, the same proximity to the action, but very different intensities of actual violence. The most powerful person in Rome's presence in the front row shaped the atmosphere of the entire building. 50,000 people taking their social cue from the emperor's reaction to whatever happened below him. Female gladiators, gladiatrices, appear in the Roman historical record as a real, if rare, feature of arena entertainment. Their presence was considered novel and somewhat scandalous by ancient commentators. The combination of femininity and armed combat sitting uneasily with Roman gender conventions. The Emperor Septimius Severus eventually banned female gladiatorial combat entirely, though his reasons appear to have been more about social propriety than safety. The front row senators watching female gladiators fight would have been watching something that their own social values classified as transgressive, a further layer of the Colosseum's capacity to simultaneously enforce and violate Roman social norms. That the same building that enforced strict gender segregation in its upper seating put women fighting on its arena floor is one of the more striking contradictions in the Colosseum's complex social life. The mortality rate among gladiators has been a subject of considerable historical debate. ancient sources, and modern archaeological evidence, sometimes pointing in different directions. The popular image of gladiatorial combat as almost always ending in death is probably an exaggeration. The training investment in a skilled gladiator was substantial, and editors had financial incentives to return fighters alive. Archaeological analysis of gladiator cemeteries, particularly one found in Ephesus, suggests that many gladiators survived multiple bouts before dying, and that some lived into middle age. A gladiator who survived enough fights could earn his freedom. The wooden sword presented to a retired gladiator, the rudis, was one of the most emotionally charged objects in Roman culture. For the front row, a gladiator earning his rudis in the arena was one of the most theatrical moments available, a life decision, a social transformation, and a display of Roman values about earned freedom all compressed into a single public gesture. The presentation of the rudis, the wooden training sword that symbolized a gladiator's liberation from the arena, typically occurred at the arena itself, sometimes directly from the hands of the editor or emperor. A front-row spectator present for this moment was witnessing one of the arena's most powerful emotional reversals, the man who had been an object of violence becoming, in a public ceremony, a free person. The crowd's reaction to a rudis presentation was typically enthusiastic, the arena's capacity for violence balanced by this demonstration of its capacity for mercy and recognition. Some gladiators, famously, chose to return to the arena even after receiving their freedom. The income, the celebrity, and perhaps the particular intensity of arena life holding attractions that civilian life could not match. That free men chose to re-enter the arena voluntarily is the most eloquent possible comment on what the Colosseum offered, and what it said about the Roman world that produced it. The midday executions at the Colosseum, the damnatio ad bestias, the condemnation to the beasts, were the most morally complex events that the front row witnessed. Unlike the gladiatorial combats, which involved trained fighters with at least a theoretical chance of survival, the damnatio was designed to produce death. The only question was the method and the pace. Criminals condemned to the beasts were typically unarmed or minimally armed, placed in the arena with animals trained to attack, and left to the natural conclusion. The midday session was traditionally less well-attended than the afternoon gladiatorial card. Romans of higher social standing sometimes used this period to eat or socialize outside the arena. Those who remained in the front row for the midday executions were therefore a self-selecting group, people who chose to watch the least ambiguous form of violence the Colosseum offered. The people condemned to the beasts at the Colosseum came from different legal and social categories, each with its own particular history. Violent criminals and murderers condemned by Roman courts were the most straightforward category, their presence in the arena a public extension of the judicial system's conclusion. Prisoners of war, brought to Rome in the triumphal processions of victorious generals, sometimes appeared in arena executions as a display of Rome's military dominance. The Christian martyrs whose deaths in the arena became a central narrative of early Christianity were a much smaller category than popular imagination suggests. The specific historical evidence for large-scale Christian executions in the Colosseum is thinner than the tradition implies. Whatever their origin, the people who died in the arena's midday sessions died in front of the most important people in Rome, a form of public death that was simultaneously a judicial act, a social performance, and a spectacle. The damnatio ad bestias took various forms. The most common involved releasing animals against unarmed or lightly armed condemned individuals. In some cases, the condemned were chained or tied to posts in the arena, preventing any possibility of evasion. In other cases, the condemned were given minimal weapons and allowed to attempt resistance, a performance that extended the duration of the event and provided more to watch than an immediate and efficient kill. The front row at a damnatio witnessed events of a kind that no modern entertainment industry would attempt to replicate, the actual deaths of actual people as public spectacle. The emotional response of the front row to these events is not straightforwardly recorded. We know what the Romans thought they were doing, but the personal emotional experience of watching these events from 20 feet away is something the historical sources do not fully illuminate. The staged mythological executions that appeared at the Colosseum during the day programs were among the most elaborately produced events in the ancient entertainment world. These performances required significant staging, costumes, trained animals, choreographed movements, and careful positioning of the condemned person at the center of the theatrical spectacle. The condemned who appeared in these spectacles were, by this point, already legally dead. Their execution was a certainty. Only its staging was in question. The theatrical framing of these deaths has been interpreted by modern historians in widely different ways. As a form of sadism, as an expression of Roman mythological obsession, or as a complex cultural ritual whose meaning is not reducible to simple categories. What is certain is that the front row witnessed these events in all their theatrical and literal detail, the myth and the reality of death simultaneously present in the same arena. The Roman crowd at a damnatio was not uniformly enthusiastic. Ancient sources record a range of responses from active engagement to evident discomfort. The philosopher Seneca, describing his experience of the arena's midday program, expresses genuine moral distress and notes that the crowd's exposure to this violence seemed to degrade rather than elevate their characters. Yet the same Seneca continued to attend. The same senators who might privately have found the midday executions distasteful sat in their front row seats and watched. The social obligation to be seen in the right place at the right time, which the front row of the Colosseum represented in the most concentrated form, was stronger than private moral discomfort. The history of the front row is partly a history of this tension between what powerful people personally thought and felt about what they were watching and the social performance they were required to maintain regardless. We have almost no accounts from the perspective of those condemned to the arena. They left no memoirs, no letters, no public statements. The exception is the early Christian martyr literature, a tradition that preserved accounts of how its members faced death in the arena and why they understood that death in terms of their faith. The Passion of Perpetua and Felicity, written in the early 3rd century, contains a remarkable first-person account by a Roman woman named Perpetua of her time in prison awaiting arena death. Her account is calm, richly detailed, and entirely focused on her spiritual experience. The arena itself appearing in her account not as a place of terror, but as the location of a transcendence she anticipates with something like eagerness. The front row senators watching Perpetua die would not have known they were witnessing the creation of one of the most read texts in the history of Christianity. One of the most extraordinary events ever staged in a Roman arena was the Naumachia, a staged naval battle conducted on water. The original Naumachia Augusti was a specially built artificial lake where Julius Caesar and then Augustus staged mock sea battles with thousands of participants. Whether the Colosseum itself was ever flooded for naval battles is debated. The engineering required was significant, and the evidence is ambiguous. If such events did occur in the Colosseum, the front row would have been watching from a seat approximately level with the water surface, the naval battle taking place at almost eye level. The image of Roman senators watching a mock naval battle from the podium of the Colosseum, their white togas at risk from the spray, is one of the more extraordinary pictures that the arena's history offers. The lions used in the damnatio ad bestias were typically well-fed animals. Starving them to produce aggression was a technique that ancient sources mention, but that modern analysis suggests was counterproductive. A hungry lion is not a reliable performer. It may refuse to attack, may attack the arena workers rather than the condemned, or may simply lie down and sleep. The most reliably aggressive behavior was produced by animals that had been teased and agitated specifically before release, a process that required skilled handlers willing to work in close proximity to large predators. The front row watching a lion released into the arena was watching an animal whose level of agitation had been carefully calibrated to produce a specific kind of performance. The management of this calibration, too passive and the crowd was disappointed, too frenzied and the animal became unpredictable, was one of the Colosseum's most demanding operational challenges. The emotional management required of a front-row spectator at the Colosseum was itself a form of performance. Roman aristocratic culture placed high value on controlled emotional display. Excessive reaction to the arena's violence, whether of horror or enthusiasm, was considered a sign of poor self-control. The senator in the front row was simultaneously watching a public spectacle and performing his own public role, his reactions as carefully managed as those of any other performer in the building. This double performance, watching while being watched, was particularly concentrated in the front row, where the emperor, the crowd, and the event itself all made claims on the spectators' attention and expression. A front-row senator at the Colosseum was, in this sense, never simply a member of the audience. He was always also part of the show. The evidence for female victims in the Colosseum's execution programs is present in the ancient sources and uncomfortable in its implications. Women convicted of capital crimes were subject to the same forms of execution as men, including damnatio ad bestias and gladiatorial-style combat. The female martyrs of the early Christian tradition, including Perpetua and her companion Felicitas, were executed by animals in the arena at Carthage, not the Colosseum, but the same system was operative throughout the Roman Empire. The front row watching female victims in the arena was watching something that violated several of Rome's most publicly stated values, while being entirely consistent with its actual legal practice. This contradiction between Roman stated values and Roman actual behavior is a thread that runs through the entire history of the Colosseum, the building simultaneously a monument to Roman power and a demonstration of the gap between Roman ideals and Roman practice. Between the midday executions and the afternoon gladiatorial program, the arena underwent a systematic cleaning and reset. Arena workers, skilled and presumably psychologically hardened by their daily work, removed bodies, raked sand, checked and repaired barrier systems, and set up any equipment needed for the afternoon's events. From the front row, this operational intermission was entirely visible, the machinery of the spectacle exposed in a way that the events themselves were designed to conceal. A senator who watched the arena being cleaned between sessions saw behind the theatrical frame of the spectacle to the logistics that made it possible. The gap between the theatrical experience of the events and the industrial reality of their production was one that the Colosseum's architecture made impossible to ignore from the front row. The velarium, a vast retractable awning that shaded the Colosseum's interior, was one of the building's most impressive engineering features. It was operated by a detachment of sailors from the Roman fleet at Misenum, whose expertise in rigging and handling large canvas was directly applicable to the awning's operation. The velarium provided shade for most of the seating, but its coverage was not uniform, and the front row podium seats were sometimes in direct sunlight when the awning's angle did not reach them. A Roman August afternoon in the Colosseum front row, without shade, in a white toga, watching gladiatorial combat in the full Mediterranean sun, represented a kind of physical discomfort that the seat's social prestige was presumably expected to compensate for. The velarium, when it worked perfectly, was a remarkable demonstration of Roman engineering ambition. When it failed or was partially deployed, the front row experienced a much less comfortable afternoon. Roman emperors sometimes threw tokens into the crowd during games, small objects that could be exchanged for gifts ranging from food to valuable prizes. These massilia were typically thrown into the general crowd rather than the front row. The senators and officials in the podium seats did not need the emperor's largesse in this form. The chaos that massilia throwing created in the upper tiers of the Colosseum was a safety hazard in its own right. Several ancient sources mention injuries caused by spectators scrambling for the tokens. The front row watched this chaos from below, safely separated from the scramble above by virtue of their social position. In the Colosseum's social geography, even the distribution of tokens reproduced the fundamental hierarchy. The front row had different privileges from the crowd above, including the privilege of not having to compete for the emperor's gifts. A full day at the Colosseum was a lengthy commitment. The morning animal hunts, the midday executions, and the afternoon gladiatorial card together occupied most of the available daylight. Food and water vendors operated throughout the building, selling refreshments through the corridors and possibly through the seating areas. The front row had access to better service than the upper tiers. Proximity to the exits allowed for easier movement, and the social status of the section meant that its occupants were better served by the arena's staff. The physical experience of spending a full day in the front row, the heat, the noise, the smell of blood and animals from 20 feet below, the constant social performance required, was demanding in ways that the seat's prestige did not entirely compensate for. A senator who had sat in the front row through a full summer's day of games had earned his prestige in more than one sense. One of the most interesting dynamics of the Colosseum front row was the constant attention directed toward the emperor when he was present. The emperor's box was visible to all 50,000 spectators, and everyone in the building was simultaneously watching the arena and watching the emperor watching the arena. The front row, closest to the emperor's box, was in the most acute version of this double observation, watching the event while being visible enough to the emperor that their own reactions were readable. A senator who showed the wrong reaction to a gladiatorial outcome, excessive sympathy for a fighter the emperor disliked, or approval for something the emperor found disappointing, was making a political statement in one of the most public settings in Rome. The front row of the Colosseum was therefore a place where political risk was present in forms that had nothing to do with lions or gladiators. The formal acknowledgement of the emperor's presence, the bow, the gesture of respect, the moment of deliberate attention directed toward the imperial box, was a ritual element of the front row experience. These acknowledgements were observed by the emperor's attendants and noted, their presence or absence forming part of the constant intelligence gathering that surrounded the imperial court. A senator who failed to perform the appropriate acknowledgement could find the omission remembered at an inconvenient moment months or years later. The front row of the Colosseum was, in this sense, a place where political allegiance was demonstrated in real time, before the largest possible audience. The danger of the front row was therefore not only the lions below and the gladiators on the sand, it was also the emperor to the side, and the thousand eyes watching what everyone in the front row did with their own. As the afternoon's gladiatorial card concluded and the crowd began to disperse through the Colosseum's 80 exits, the front row emptied last. The senators and officials who had occupied the podium seats through the day's events filed out with the deliberate dignity that their position required. The arena floor below them, now quiet, bore the marks of the day's events in the raked and bloodied sand. Whatever the day had contained, spectacular animal hunts, legally precise executions, technically brilliant gladiatorial combat, it was over, absorbed into the city's daily life. The senator who walked home through the Roman evening carried with him whatever he had seen, whatever he had felt, and whatever he had been required to publicly perform. The front row's particular form of experience settling into memory alongside the 1,000 other experiences of Roman public life. The Colosseum's history includes several documented incidents in which things went wrong in ways that affected spectator safety. The most famous pre-Colosseum disaster occurred at Fidene in 27 AD, when a temporary wooden amphitheater collapsed during gladiatorial games, killing or injuring tens of thousands of spectators. This catastrophe was one of the factors that motivated the construction of permanent stone amphitheaters, including, eventually, the Colosseum. The Colosseum's stone construction made structural collapse much less likely, but it introduced different risks, including the possibility of crowd stampedes in the narrow corridors and staircases. The 80 exits of the Colosseum, designed to empty the building in minutes, were the primary safety system for crowd management, reflecting a sophisticated awareness of the dangers of large crowds in enclosed spaces. The Colosseum's engineering was remarkably sophisticated by ancient standards, its concrete and stone construction designed to distribute loads in ways that prevented the catastrophic failures seen in earlier wooden structures. Roman engineers used a combination of travertine limestone, volcanic tuff, brick, and concrete, each material employed in the location where its particular properties were most advantageous. The building's elliptical plan, its system of radiating arches, and its concrete vaulting all reflected a deep understanding of structural behavior that took centuries to rediscover after Rome's decline. The regular maintenance inspections that the Colosseum required, checking for cracks, damaged stonework, or failing mortar, were a form of safety management that the Romans took seriously. The building that stands today, damaged by earthquakes and stripped of much of its facing stone, is a testament to the durability of its original construction and to the quality of the engineering decisions made by its unknown architects. Natural disasters, storms, earthquakes, lightning strikes, occasionally interrupted games at the Colosseum and created genuine danger for spectators. A large crowd of 50,000 people caught in a sudden storm in an open-air structure had limited options. The Colosseum's corridor system provided some shelter, but could not accommodate the entire crowd simultaneously. Lightning strikes to the Colosseum are recorded in ancient sources. The building's height and metal fittings made it a natural target. An earthquake during a game's event, a plausible scenario given Rome's seismic location, would have created a catastrophic situation. A large crowd in a stone structure, animals loose in the arena, and the infrastructure of the underground hypogeum potentially compromised. That no such earthquake disaster is recorded during the Colosseum's active period may reflect genuine good fortune rather than the absence of seismic events. Crowd violence at Roman arena events was not unheard of. The most famous ancient example occurred at Pompeii in 59 AD, where a riot between local fans and visitors from Nicaea resulted in deaths and a 10-year ban on gladiatorial games. The Colosseum's Praetorian Guard presence was partly a response to the risk of crowd violence. Soldiers positioned throughout the building to manage any disorder. The dynamics of a riot in the Colosseum would have been different from the front row and the upper tiers. The front row's relatively small number of socially powerful occupants were less likely to participate in crowd violence, but more likely to be targets of it if it spread downward. Political tension in Rome sometimes expressed itself through arena crowds. Popular sentiment for or against specific policies, individuals, or events finding a voice in the 50,000-strong audience at the games. The emperor who sat in the front row listening to the crowd's noise was receiving real-time political intelligence about the mood of the city. Several Roman emperors had notably poor experiences with Colosseum crowds, their presence in the front row exposing them to public disapproval in ways that other public appearances did not. Caligula reportedly responded to audience disapproval by having sections of the crowd thrown to the animals, an anecdote that may be exaggerated but reflects the real tension between imperial power and crowd expression. Domitian expelled spectators he found personally irritating, using his imperial authority to manage the audience in ways that only an absolute monarch could attempt. The public nature of the Colosseum meant that an emperor's behavior there was immediately known throughout Rome, the most public stage in the ancient world, amplifying both his popularity and his failures. The front row that the emperor occupied was therefore the most exposed position in Rome, the place where his relationship with the Roman people was most directly and publicly tested. Before the Colosseum was built, Rome's arena entertainments took place in temporary wooden structures and in the Circus Maximus, a chariot racing venue that was occasionally reconfigured for other events. The social dynamics of these earlier venues established the patterns that the Colosseum would formalize and make permanent. The front row experience in the temporary wooden amphitheaters was different from the Colosseum, the structure itself less stable, the proximity to the arena potentially even more immediate. The collapse at Fidene and the numerous other structural failures recorded in temporary amphitheaters established a background of real danger against which the Colosseum's permanent construction represented a genuine safety improvement. The senators who moved from rickety wooden temporary structures to the stone permanence of the Colosseum's front row were, in one sense at least, occupying a significantly safer seat than their predecessors had. The ancient sources that document Colosseum incidents are varied in their reliability, some contemporaneous accounts, some written generations after the events described. The Roman historians Suetonius, Cassius Dio, and Martial provide some of the most detailed accounts of specific events, but all of them were writing for audiences that shared their cultural assumptions, making interpretation complicated. The letters of Pliny the Younger, who attended games and wrote extensively about Roman public life, provide some of the most nuanced contemporary perspectives on what the arena meant to its participants. The Historia Augusta, a collection of imperial biographies of uncertain reliability, is a major source for stories of dangerous or unusual arena events, but its accuracy is consistently contested by modern historians. Reading these sources tonight, we are receiving filtered accounts of events that occurred 2,000 years ago, and the distance is both the source of their interest and the limit of our certainty about them. The velarium, the great awning system, was a mechanical system of considerable complexity, and like all complex mechanical systems, it occasionally failed. Ancient sources mention the velarium in the context of its provision of shade rather than its failures, but the engineering complexity of a fabric awning covering an 80,000-seat amphitheater suggests that failures were not unusual. A velarium failure during a full arena day, canvas falling into the front row, poles collapsing, rigging becoming tangled, would have created a chaotic and potentially dangerous situation. The sailors who operated the velarium were experienced and skilled, but the scale of the system placed limits on how quickly any problem could be identified and addressed. The front row, sitting under the inner edge of the velarium when it was deployed, was in the position of first impact if a central section failed. The process of moving animals from the hypogeum to the arena was one of the most operationally complex and potentially dangerous aspects of the Colosseum's daily function. Animals that escaped from their handlers during this transit, in the tunnels, at the cage lifts, or in the corridors adjacent to the arena, created situations that the building's safety arrangements were not specifically designed to handle. Ancient sources contain references to animal escapes that are difficult to interpret precisely. It is not always clear whether the escape occurred in the arena or in the building's backstage areas. An animal loose in the hypogeum was dangerous primarily to the workers there. An animal loose in the corridors near the seating could, in principle, reach the seated spectators. The barriers designed to protect the front row from the arena were not designed to handle an animal that arrived from a different direction. The assumption was that the threat came from below, not from the corridors to the side. The Colosseum's 80 exits were designed to evacuate the building in approximately 15 minutes, a figure that modern crowd flow analysis has largely confirmed is accurate. This rapid evacuation capacity was not merely a courtesy to spectators. It was a security system designed to allow the crowd to disperse quickly in the event of any kind of emergency. The drills and procedures that governed evacuation were managed by the arena's staff and the Praetorian Guard soldiers positioned throughout the building. The front row's evacuation route was different from the general crowds. The podium seats had separate access to the building's external structures, reflecting the social separation that governed every aspect of the experience. Even in an emergency, the Romans maintained the hierarchy, the senators and officials in the front row evacuating through different routes than the ordinary citizens above them. Rome sits in a seismically active region. Earthquakes of varying magnitudes are a regular feature of the Italian geological landscape. The Colosseum survived numerous earthquakes across its centuries of use, its design providing considerable resilience against seismic forces. The earthquakes that occurred after the Colosseum ceased to be used as an arena, particularly in 1349, caused significant structural damage, collapsing the outer south wall. During the building's active period, smaller earthquakes may have caused localized damage, cracked stonework, displaced barriers, disrupted mechanical systems in the hypogeum. The front row sitting in the Colosseum during a seismic event would have experienced the building's response to ground motion in a way that was simultaneously terrifying and, by the standards of Roman construction, probably survivable. The Colosseum was not exclusively an entertainment venue. It was also used for religious ceremonies, political gatherings, and other public events that the Roman state organized. These non-arena events carried different risk profiles for the front row. Without animals or gladiators, the physical danger was minimal, but the political stakes could be just as high. A public ceremony at the Colosseum with the emperor present was an occasion for the same careful social performance that accompanied the games, but with the added complexity of whatever political content the ceremony carried. The front row's occupants at a religious ceremony were still being watched, still performing their public roles, still navigating the complex social politics of being the most visible people in the most public building in Rome. The Colosseum's danger, in this sense, was not only the danger of the arena. It was the danger of public life in a system where the most powerful person in the world was always present and always watching. The decline of gladiatorial games in the late Roman Empire was a gradual process driven by multiple factors: economic, political, and religious. The costs of mounting elaborate arena spectacles had always been enormous, and as the empire's financial situation deteriorated in the 3rd and 4th centuries, the frequency and scale of games declined. The Christian emperors who succeeded Constantine were ambivalent about the games at best. Honorius officially banned gladiatorial combat in 404 AD, though the ban was not immediately or universally effective. The last certain gladiatorial contest in the Colosseum is dated to 404 AD, after which animal hunts continued for another century before also ceasing. The front row that had been the most coveted position in Roman public life gradually fell empty, the social machinery that had made it the center of Roman power politics ceasing to function as the empire that sustained it contracted and transformed. After the end of arena use, the Colosseum entered a long period of alternative uses and gradual spoliation. Medieval Romans used the building as a fortress, as housing, as a source of stone for other building projects, and as a Christian sacred site associated with the memory of the martyrs. The travertine limestone blocks of the outer wall, the marble that had faced the seating, the bronze clamps that held the stones together, all were systematically removed across the medieval centuries. The front row seats themselves, the stone benches of the podium level where senators had watched lions and gladiators, were stripped of their marble facing and eventually left as the bare stone visible today. The names carved into those front row seats by their original occupants, Dexter and the priests and the guild representatives, are still there on some of the surviving stones, more durable than the social system that made them meaningful. The Colosseum's hypogeum, the elaborate underground system that made the arena's spectacles possible, was not discovered by modern archaeologists until the 20th century. For much of the medieval and early modern period, the arena floor was covered in earth and vegetation, the underground chambers unknown and inaccessible. The excavations that revealed the hypogeum transformed our understanding of how the Colosseum actually worked, the mechanical sophistication of the ancient entertainment industry becoming visible for the first time in over a millennium. What the excavations revealed was a system of extraordinary complexity: elevators, animal passages, water management, and crew facilities all integrated into a seamless operational whole. From the front row, none of this infrastructure had been visible. The spectators saw only the surface of an arena that made the elaborate appear effortless. The Colosseum today receives millions of visitors annually, making it one of the most visited historical sites in the world. The front row seats that senators reserved with carved inscriptions are accessible to any visitor with a ticket, the most democratic version of the Colosseum's social hierarchy that the building has ever seen. Modern visitors sitting in the area of the ancient podium seats can look down at the exposed hypogeum, the underground infrastructure visible in a way it never was to Roman spectators. The view from the approximate location of the front row today is very different from what it was in the 2nd century. The arena floor partially excavated, the building open to the sky, the roar of ancient crowds replaced by the quieter noise of 21st century tourism. Yet the stones are the same stones, the curved wall the same wall, and the distance from the front row to the arena floor the same distance that once separated senators from lions. The Colosseum at night, illuminated by modern floodlights, presents a face that its builders would not quite recognize. The facing stone gone, the wooden floors absent, the building's interior visible from outside in ways it was never designed to permit. Yet the essential structure remains. The arches, the elliptical plan, the sequence of tiers rising from the arena floor to the sky. Something about the building's scale and presence at night is more directly legible than in full daylight. The archaeology of power made visible by the shadows. The front row's location is marked today by nothing more than the arrangement of surviving stonework. No seats, no inscriptions, no barriers. But the space is there, and the distance is there, and sitting in that space tonight, in imagination, in the quiet of this slow story, puts you 20 feet from where the lions walked. The front row senator who walked home from the Colosseum at the end of a full day of games was carrying an experience that no modern equivalent can replicate. He had watched animals from 3 continents perform and die within 20 feet of his seat. He had helped decide whether specific gladiators lived or died. He had participated in public rituals of Roman power in the most public building in the world. He had maintained his social performance for hours, managing his reactions for the benefit of the emperor's watching attendants and the scrutiny of his peers. He had sat in a seat whose safety was guaranteed by a stone wall, some rope nets, a line of soldiers, and the somewhat optimistic assumption that the animals below would behave in ways consistent with what the editor had planned. He walked home through Rome in the evening light, past buildings that would outlast his name, through a city that was simultaneously the center of the world and, already, beginning the long process of becoming history. The question that gave tonight's story its beginning, how dangerous was the front row of the Colosseum, has no single answer. It was dangerous in ways that varied by event, by emperor, by the particular animal or gladiator performing on a given afternoon, and by the quality of the barrier maintenance that week. It was also dangerous in ways that had nothing to do with lions or gladiators. The political risks of being visible in the most public space in Rome, of making the wrong gesture at the wrong moment, of attracting the attention of an emperor who collected slights. The front row of the Colosseum was the most coveted and the most exposed position in Roman public life, a place where status and vulnerability arrived together, inseparable and equally intense. Let this complexity rest gently in your thoughts now, as the Colosseum grows quiet in the moonlight and the last details of the day's events settle into the past. The Roman Empire that the Colosseum served was itself an extraordinary and temporary thing, the largest political structure the Western world had ever produced, and one that would eventually, inevitably, cease to exist. The senators who sat in the Colosseum's front row were the inheritors of a tradition of power that stretched back 8 centuries, and the witnesses to a civilization that would eventually leave nothing standing except its stone. They did not know that the empire would fall. They knew only that it had always been there and appeared likely to continue. The confidence with which they occupied their front row seats, the casual assumption that they deserved to be closest to the spectacle, closest to the emperor, closest to the violence, was the confidence of people who had never seriously contemplated the possibility that the system they lived within might end. The system ended. The seats remain. The carved names in the Colosseum seating stones are among the most direct personal connections to ancient Rome that survive. Whoever Dexter was, the name appears in one of the best preserved front row inscriptions. He was a specific person who sat in a specific seat and had enough social standing to carve his claim to it in stone. He lived in Rome in some period between the 1st and 5th centuries. He attended games. He sat in the front row. He watched what we have been describing tonight. Beyond that, nothing is known of him, not his life, his family, his opinions, or the century in which he lived. His name is still there, in the stone he had it carved in, 20 feet from where the lions walked. The arena floor that was raked smooth between events, that absorbed blood and sand and the traces of 100 different kinds of violence, is exposed today to the open sky. The wood that once covered the hypogeum is gone. Only the stone framework of the underground remains. What happened on that floor across 4 centuries of continuous use is documented only partially. In the written accounts of those who attended, in the graffiti of fans, in the physical evidence that archaeology has gradually uncovered. The floor itself absorbed everything and gave back nothing. Patient, indifferent, and capable of being cleaned and raked smooth for the next day's entertainment. Tonight it is quiet, and the moonlight covers it, and the lions and the gladiators are equally gone. The stones of the Colosseum are approximately 2,000 years old, quarried, shaped, and placed by workers whose names are as lost as those of the people who sat in the front row above them. These stones have survived Rome's decline, the medieval period, repeated earthquakes, centuries of spoliation, and the particular form of survival that involves being endlessly studied and visited. They remember nothing. Stone has no memory, but they preserve, in their arrangement and their dimensions, the exact spatial relationships that the Roman designers intended. The distance from the front row to the arena floor is still 13 to 15 feet. The angle of the podium wall is still what it was when a senator first sat above it and watched a lion. Some forms of evidence are more patient than any document. The stone remembers the engineering decision, even when everything else about the moment it served is gone. The Colosseum that exists today is a ruin in the most technically precise sense, a building that once had more and now has less. It has lost its upper tiers, its marble cladding, its wooden floors, its velarium, its barrier systems, its underground machinery, and all of its human contents. What remains is the structural skeleton, the bones of an idea about what public spectacle could be, stripped of everything that once made it function. In this stripped condition, the building is paradoxically more legible than it was when complete, the engineering logic visible in ways that the finished surface once concealed. The ruin tells a different story from the building, not the story of Roman power and confidence, but the story of time and its patient, systematic removal of everything that was not stone. After the arena's closure, the Colosseum's meaning transformed completely, from a monument to Roman entertainment and power to a sacred space associated with the memory of Christian martyrs. The cross erected in the arena center during the medieval period was a deliberate inversion of the building's original purpose, the instrument of Roman execution becoming the symbol of Christian redemption. This transformation is one of the more dramatic reversals in the history of any building. The same space reinterpreted by a religious tradition that had been among the victims of its original purpose. The Colosseum's capacity to absorb this transformation, to remain itself while being entirely repurposed, is a measure of its architectural power. Tonight, the cross is there in the arena's center, and the ancient stones are there around it, and both things coexist in the way that only a building with enough history can accommodate. The gladiator who walked out of the arena alive, who survived a bout, received the crowd's approval, and walked back through the gate of life, experienced a moment that no front-row senator ever experienced in quite the same way. He had been the center of 50,000 people's attention. He had performed, fought, and survived under the most intense public scrutiny the ancient world offered. The walk back through the tunnel, away from the noise and into the relative quiet of the podium, must have been one of the most disorienting transitions a human being can experience. What he thought about the people in the front row, the senators and officials whose decision had just confirmed his survival, is something the historical record does not preserve. But the distance between them, 20 feet of sand and an entire social world, was, in that moment, as real and as charged as anything the Colosseum contained. The front row seats are empty tonight, as they have been empty for 16 centuries. The names carved in some of them suggest the people who once occupied them, Dexter and the priests and the guild representatives, but the people themselves are gone. What remains is the stone and the space and the distance to the arena floor, which is still 13 feet, still the same decision made by the engineers who built the barrier. That decision, how close is safe, how close is acceptable, how much distance between the most important people in the world and the most dangerous things they want to watch, is a question that every entertainment culture has to answer for itself. The Romans answered it one way. We answer it differently. The answer to how dangerous it was depends on what you were willing to risk for the privilege of being closest to the show. The lion that looked up from the arena floor at the senators in the front row was seeing something that its experience had not prepared it to understand. 50,000 people in tiered rows, noise at a volume it had never encountered, sunlight and shade in unfamiliar patterns, the smell of sand and blood, and tens of thousands of human beings. Its response to this situation was shaped by its nature, by the hunger or agitation the arena workers had carefully calibrated, by its individual temperament, by the specific circumstances of that particular afternoon. Whether it tested the barrier depended on all of these variables, variables that the most careful Roman editor could influence, but not control. This uncontrollability was, in the end, the source of the front row's most genuine danger, not the average animal behaving predictably, but the occasional animal that didn't. The Colosseum was, for the Romans who lived beside it, an ordinary feature of the city, a building that had always been there and was always available for the next season of games. Its monumental scale and the extraordinary violence of its entertainments were normalized by their regularity, the extraordinary becoming routine through repetition. The front-row senators who attended games season after season across decades of Roman public life experienced the Colosseum as one element among many of what it meant to hold power in Rome. The danger of the front row was similarly normalized, a background feature of a position that carried many risks, arena-related and otherwise. That this normalization is itself one of the most interesting and troubling aspects of the Colosseum story is something that the modern visitor to the ruins is perhaps better positioned to see than the Roman who sat in the front row ever was. At dawn, the Colosseum is quieter than at any other time. The tourists not yet present, the city still in its early morning state. The stones catch the first light in the same sequence they have caught it for 2,000 years. The east face lighting first, the shadow retreating as the sun rises. Birds nest in the surviving stonework, pigeons and jackdaws occupying the niches and recesses that once held statuary and architectural ornament. The building at dawn is most purely itself, stripped of its human context, present only as stone and light and the mathematical precision of its engineering. Let this dawn quietness settle over your thoughts now, the ancient stone warming in the first light of a morning 2,000 years away from the lions. The arena floor between events was one of the most efficiently managed spaces in the ancient world. The teams of arena workers who maintained it, cleaning, raking, resetting, were skilled professionals whose work was essential to the Colosseum's function. They moved through the arena floor in the intervals between events with a practiced efficiency that was invisible to the crowd but essential to the spectacle. The dropped weapons, the bloodied sand, the marks left by animal hooves and gladiatorial footwork, all of it erased and replaced within minutes, ready for the next event. The arena floor's capacity for renewal, for absorbing whatever happened and returning to a clean surface, was one of the Colosseum's most essential metaphors for Roman power. The Colosseum's shadow fell across the streets of ancient Rome at the same hours it falls across those streets today, the sun's angle and the building's height producing the same geometry across 2 millennia. Walking in the Colosseum's shadow in the Roman afternoon, you are walking in the same shadow that Romans walked in on afternoons when the sounds of the crowd could be heard outside the walls. The building was so central to Roman urban life that its sounds, the roar of the crowd, the noise of animals, the trumpets that signaled key moments in the program, were simply part of the soundscape of the surrounding neighborhood. A Roman who lived near the Colosseum heard these sounds regularly without attending. The arena's events present in the life of the city whether or not you chose to go inside. Tonight the shadow is moonlight and the sounds are gone, but the geometry is the same. The building present in the city around it in the same physical way it has always been. The senators who occupied the Colosseum's front row spent the rest of their working lives in very different buildings: the Senate House, the law courts, the public spaces of Roman civic life. The skills required to navigate the front row, political judgment, emotional management, careful reading of the emperor's intentions, were the same skills required in every other arena of Roman public life. The Colosseum was, in this sense, not a departure from Roman political life, but a concentrated version of it. The same competition for position, the same performance of status, the same proximity to power and its dangers. A senator who managed the front row skillfully was demonstrating the same competencies that would serve him in the Senate, in the courts, and in the private rooms where Roman power was actually negotiated. The front row was a school, a stage, and a court all at once, and the education it provided in the mechanics of Roman power was available nowhere else in quite the same concentrated form. A Roman who had sat in the Colosseum's front row across decades of public life would have accumulated memories of the building that no single account could contain. The individual events, the particular lion that tested the barrier, the gladiator who appealed for mercy and received it, the emperor whose expression they had watched carefully for signs, would have formed a private archive of Roman public life. These memories are entirely lost. The private experiences of public spectators absorbed into the silence that time makes of everything personal. What remains is only the public record, the account of events, the physical evidence of the building, the carved names in the seats. The private experience of the front row, what it actually felt like to sit there, to smell the arena below, to hear the crowd around you, to watch the emperor's face while watching the lion, is gone as completely as the people who had it. The moon that rises over the Colosseum tonight has risen over it every night for 2,000 years. It rose over the building when it was new and noisy, when it was old and repurposed, when it was ruined and stripped, and when it was restored and studied. The moon's light on ancient stone is one of the most peaceful things the world offers. The absence of color and the presence of form producing something that requires no interpretation. Let that moonlight rest in your thoughts now, without any further history attached to it. Just the light and the stone and the long silence of a building that has been very many things and is now, tonight, simply present. The front row is empty. The arena is quiet. The lions are 2,000 years gone, and the stone is exactly where it was. The arches of the Colosseum's outer wall frame the city beyond them, Rome visible through the gaps in the ancient stone like a series of paintings in fixed frames. Each arch is the same arch, repeated 80 times around the building's elliptical perimeter, individual and also part of a pattern whose total effect is much larger than any single element. The engineering decision that produced these arches, the choice of the elliptical plan, the radiating barrel vaults, the systematic repetition of structural elements, was made by someone whose name we do not know and whose work has lasted 2,000 years. The arch is the Roman contribution to structural engineering, the discovery that a curved form could bear loads that a flat form could not, and the Colosseum is its greatest expression. Let the arch hold your thoughts gently now, as you drift toward the quiet end of tonight's long story. The last event of the last day of gladiatorial combat at the Colosseum ended sometime around 404 AD, more than 3 centuries after the building opened. The senators who sat in the front row for that final event did not know it was the final event. They sat in the same seats, watched the same kind of combat, and left through the same exits as every other day. The continuity of that experience, the same building, the same seats, the same program, persisting until the day it simply stopped, is one of the quieter historical facts about the Colosseum's end. No one announced the last day. No one marked the closing. The games simply ceased to be organized, and the building found other purposes. The front row sat empty for the first time, and has been empty since, and will be empty tonight as your thoughts find their way towards sleep. And so, the long and patient story of how dangerous the front row of the Colosseum was comes quietly to its end. We have sat in the seats of senators, watched the lions pace the arena floor, seen the gladiators appeal for mercy from 20 feet away, and felt the particular political danger of being visible in the most public place in Rome. The front row was dangerous in multiple registers. Physically, when the barrier systems were tested by 500 pounds of North African lion, and politically, when the emperor's gaze fell on the people beside him and noted what they did. It was also the most coveted position in the Roman world, the place where power and spectacle met most completely, and where the Roman self-understanding of what it meant to be the center of the world was most intensely expressed. Good night, and rest peacefully, in the long, quiet, ancient shadow of a building that once held the loudest crowd in the world, and now holds only moonlight and stone and the patient memory of 20 centuries of human ambition.